Welcome everybody to the last breakout session of the day. I'm really excited about this one, Marketing Our Movement. And my name is Chad Goote. I'm the Vice President of Development for Atlas Network. And I'm joined by Spencer Wixom, is the Chief Customer Officer at Challenger, a global research, training, and consulting firm focused on complex sales. Really excited for what he has to say and share. So he will take it away. I'll come back with some Q&A, and then we will also open it up to those in the audience for your questions as well. Spencer, welcome.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you, everyone. Just before I get started, I want to say quickly what a pleasure this has been and what an honor to be invited and to be able to participate in this. I'm a sales and marketing guy. I lead a sales and marketing consultancy called Challenger. I'll give you a little bit of a background as I go through some research and some ideas here this afternoon. But to be a part of an event like this where people are exploring and working towards the kinds of ideas and action and movements that I've seen has been very inspiring. And I admire the work that's being done, the courage and the dedication that so many here I've seen have to this work. So thank you for that. I need a clicker or else I'm not going to get through this. So what I want to talk to you about today are principles that I have learned, that we have discovered doing research and implementing sales and marketing best practices in organizations all over the world. We began this research about 12 years ago, and I'm going to tell you some stories, and I'm going to walk you through some of these ideas. And we've been continuing that research as we've seen environments change. Difficult times like the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the emergence of COVID in early 2020, and also very good economic times. But we see some very consistent patterns in what those who are most able to persuade and motivate action in others do. And I want to share with you, using both data and some anecdotes and stories, what that is all about. But there's a key theme that I want to focus on in this presentation today, and that theme was first penned by David Ogilvy, but it's more recently been mentioned by Rory Sutherland, who is a key leader in the Ogilvy Advertising Agency. But this is a concept that I want you to stay focused on as I present today. And it says, people don't choose brand A over brand B because A is better, but because they are more certain that A is good. Certainty to take action. That is a concept I want to talk about today. What's very interesting is I was listening last night to the Shark Tank pitches, and you noticed what the judges were asking, the topics they were asking about. They were drilling in on the certainty of those various opportunities. How certain am I that that is a good opportunity, that it can be sustained, that it can actually have the effect and get the participation that we're looking for? Individuals, human beings, we are drawn to certainty in making decisions. And what creates certainty or what limits certainty in our decision making, those are some of the things I want to explore today. Let's start by thinking about what happens when decision makers are uncertain. And this is an interesting piece of research that we did a few years ago when we were part of Corporate Executive Board. The group I'm a part of, Challenger, was at one point a part of a global best practices organization called Corporate Executive Board, if you're familiar. We were later sold to and were a part of Gartner and part of their research division for a while, and then most recently have been stood up as our own business. But when we were part of CEB, we did some really interesting research on decision making and found when you put these two axes together, the vertical axis, which is the degree of difficulty in making a decision. So we asked a number of individuals who were buying something, who were making a decision, to rate the degree of difficulty in that decision and plotted that on an x-axis. On a y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we plotted the degree of buyer's remorse that you felt after having made that purchase or made that decision. What was interesting to us was this strong linear correlation between the two, which means if your decision-making process is difficult, if you struggle, if it's uncertain, then it is highly likely that you will also feel buyer's remorse or regret in having made the decision. So if you are somebody who is persuading those individuals to make a decision, you need to be cognizant of this. You need to consider that the difficulty of the process will reflect on the individual's satisfaction with having made that decision. And what's interesting, particularly in today's environment, is oftentimes when that process is difficult, when you struggle to make that decision and a group is trying to come to consensus in making a decision, the decision might often be not to decide. And in fact, in our research, we found near 40% of the time, a buying group or a group trying to make a decision decided not to decide. And you can imagine the struggle or the waste of resources and time and effort on both sides when that decision is not to decide. So what's interesting in the research that we did, so we also went out to these buyers and we said, okay, you have these struggles in your decision-making journey. Oftentimes you decide not to decide. What did the individual who was helping you make that decision or who was selling to you do to influence the decisions you made, to help you in that decision-making journey? And then we mapped all of those responses in a word cloud. And as you can imagine, the most common response was not one we like to hear. And this is because individuals, in my experience, salespeople, but you can also think about this as anyone involved in supporting a decision, aren't wired this way. We're wired to promote what we have to offer, not to necessarily support the decision-making process that's happening. And that's the change in mindset, the change in thinking that needs to happen among individuals who are trying to persuade, who are trying to sell. We need to consider the decision-making process, the buying process of the individuals we are trying to persuade or sell to. So this is an interesting piece of research that goes back a number of years. And this is really what started this movement that we have been exploring. What we did back in 2007 and 2008, right at the height of the financial crisis, we noticed something different in buyer behavior generally. Individuals making decisions were making decisions in a very different way. And we wanted to understand what led to those decisions, what factored in to doing one thing versus another thing. And so we went out to a group of about 6,000 individuals making complex decisions in a business-to-business sales environment. And we asked those individuals to evaluate the various elements of that decision and the people, the sellers or the organizations who were calling on them and selling something to them. And what was interesting is they allocated, call it a 100 pennies exercise. They allocated different weightings to different categories of the individuals who were selling to them. And we broke that down into 4 major categories. But what's interesting and counterintuitive here are some of the things that you would traditionally think would motivate organizations to make a decision, would have them be loyal to a particular supplier or loyal to a particular organization who's trying to sell to them, didn't necessarily turn out that way. So what we found in our study, if you think about what leads to loyalty, call it customer or client loyalty, loyalty between two individuals doing a transaction with each other, what leads to that loyalty is not necessarily the company or the brand that you as a person selling or persuading represent. In fact, that only represents 19% of the whole equation. And then if you look at the product or the service that you supply to that individual on the other side of the table, that only represents 19% as well. Or the value of what you provide compared to the cost for that individual on the other side of the table, that's only 9%. Now, the interesting question here is why? Why is this the case that these 3 elements that you would think would create loyalty, create an interest in somebody to buy from you, why do they represent only 47% of this equation? And the answer is because you cannot easily differentiate these to those others who are competing in your space. You may have a strong brand or a strong company reputation or an organizational reputation, but so do others who are asking donors for money. You may have a really interesting product or service that you offer, but so do others in your space. You may provide incredible value for the money, but so do others in your space. It's difficult to differentiate around these. But what you can differentiate around, what we found in this study, is that orange bar up there in the top right, the sales experience or the persuasive experience. The journey that you support, the insight that you bring, that can truly differentiate you from others in your space and support the decision-making journey of those you're trying to persuade. This was a really important finding for us, and we've spent the last decade or so really diving deeper into it and exploring it much more. And in fact, more recently, we went out to a group of buyers similar to our original study because we wanted to pinpoint in 2019, 2020, in this current environment, what were the skills or the behaviors or the characteristics of individuals in a position to sell or persuade that these buyers or these decision makers were most looking for? What was most important to them to see in a sales experience? And it comes down to 5 important behaviors. And let's go through these real quick. Number 1, you demonstrate unique insight or perspective. You bring an idea to these individuals that they hadn't before considered. Something novel, something interesting is part of the conversation. Number 2, you actively help them in making a decision. You recognize the complexity of that decision-making process and you actively support it. Number 3, you understand and address the unique needs of different stakeholders in that decision-making group or buying group. Today's decisions are made not by individuals, but by consensus among groups. And you have to understand what is the common thread or idea that will bring consensus among that group. Number 4, you help them build support across their organization for that idea, bringing those stakeholders together in the idea. Number 5, you make it easy for them to make a purchase. You may make it easy for them to decide or be encouraged around an idea, but can you help them complete a transaction, actually go to do business or come to some kind of agreement? So these are the 5 behaviors or characteristics of individuals selling or persuading that are most important in the eyes of those they sell to or persuade. But the question is, we've gone through all of this turmoil with COVID in this new environment that we're in. How are people who sell or persuade doing against these 5 key behaviors or characteristics? So we did this study in 2019. We did the study again in late 2020 to see if there was any difference. Remember, this is in the perspective of buyers or decision makers, evaluating those who are selling or persuading them. And the news is not good. In fact, the average capability in the mind of buyers or those being persuaded around those who are selling to them fell on average 40% from 2019 to post-pandemic in late 2020. Now, what does that tell us? It doesn't tell us that people have all of a sudden become really bad at doing their job, meaning they can no longer persuade to the way they used to. What it does tell us is that individuals in a position to decide or to buy something have raised the bar significantly for the experience they want to see from those who call on them. We need to be much more effective in creating a persuasive experience because they're looking for so much more from us now in this more uncertain environment than they were even just a few years ago. So let's talk about how we can do that, what's involved in that. And there's really 3 elements to consider. And I want to go through each of these 3 separately to help you understand how they come together. Number 1 is having the right message. And I want to connect a little bit to what happened yesterday if you were in the storytelling session with Jacqueline and Richard and Daniel. I want to talk a little bit and connect some of the points to what they talked about around having the right message as part of a persuasive dialogue or conversation. Secondly, I want to talk about having the right skills to do it effectively. Jacqueline yesterday in that presentation said something that stood out to me. She says it's not just about the message, it's about the, let's see if I can get this right. It's about the kind of the integrity or the authenticity of the messenger. And you have to have both. You have to have a strong message and an individual with the skill to perform that message in a compelling way. But number 3, and this one's very important to consider as well, is the right decision maker. Are we influencing, presenting to, working actively with the right decision makers, the right kinds of individuals who can mobilize our concept and build consensus around our concept with a broader organization? And I'm going to share with you some research about that I find very interesting. But let's start with the right message. I want to give you a little bit of a historical perspective on commercial messaging and where commercial messaging has gone in the last few decades. If you go back about 30, 40 years or so, the standard for commercial messaging was what we would call product-based or service-based or solution-based, right? You would go in to a particular customer or client or organization. You would say, these are the offerings we have. This is how they fit your needs. You can see we have a full portfolio here, the features and benefits we present to you. And you'll compare those on their merits to features and benefits of other solutions. The problem, particularly today, is many will ask, is this essential? Is this something truly compelling or important for me to take action against? Is it a nice to have or a need to have? So there was an interesting evolution. This took place in the late 70s into the early 80s and sustained for quite a while, where a lot of organizations would say, well, don't go in and focus on our features and benefits of our solution or the idea that we have. Instead, go in and ask some open-ended questions to try to understand the needs or the interests of the other party, and then layer the solution on top. So it's very good because you can tailor that solution to the individuals you're talking to. The concern, however, is you're not spending effectively the individual's time on the other side of the table. That individual might ask, do I really have time for this type of conversation? So then we saw this interesting evolution to what we call insight-based selling, which is the idea that you come in with a unique perspective, a problem that you uncover in the customer's or others' business or organization, and expose that problem to them, and then lead to a solution. And it's this third evolution, the insight-based, that I want to talk to you a little bit more about today and show you some research that grounds why this is so important. So we did a study a couple of years ago where we had individuals making a decision, evaluate the content or the message that was used to help them make that decision, and evaluate which components of that message were helpful and not helpful in changing their direction or changing their perspective. What's interesting with this data and this study is, first of all, on the right-hand side, what does not support that decision-making. Having content or collateral, so to speak, that is accessible or quick to find or containing interesting facts or anecdotes or easy to understand, providing a smart or expert perspective. In our study, there was no statistically significant correlation between these factors being present and driving a change in a decision maker's direction or motivation to action. And why is that? Because most content has this. Most content that you'll see out there is easy to understand, accessible or quick to find, or contains interesting facts or anecdotes. There's nothing truly differentiating about content with these particular features. But there are two features that have a statistically significant benefit in changing direction or motivating someone to take action. And those are content that, one, teaches them something new, and number two, gives them a compelling reason to take action. Now just keep that in mind as we go through this and think about, what are the elements in a message that, number one, teach them something new, and number two, give them a compelling reason to take action. When you're building certainty in the mind of a decision maker, these two elements are very critical to consider. So let me share with you a little bit of a case study around this that we worked on a few years ago that I'm hoping applies somewhat to the space that you're in. And it's with an organization called Ascent Capital Management, which was the wealth management division of U.S. Bank. And where they found themselves, they were a much smaller wealth management organization compared to, say, a Morgan Stanley or a Goldman Sachs or a Credit Suisse, trying to compete very ultra-high net worth individuals, trying to get the attention of these individuals and do business with them. Now, historically or traditionally, wealth management is sold by the power of your brand or your company's history or the compelling nature of the product you have to offer. That was typically what the pitch consisted of. But Ascent realized we have to do something different. We have to present our value proposition in a different in kind way to get the attention of the individuals we want to sell to. So rather than, on the left-hand side is shown here, leading with their unique benefits, leading with their features of their offer, which they had traditionally done, they turned the conversation on its head. And rather, they taught about the concerns with passing wealth from one generation to the next generation without a proper plan for communication and family dynamics. So our conversation isn't about the portfolio of products that Ascent has to offer. Our conversation is about generational wealth transfer. Our conversation is around communication and family dynamics and solving for those dynamics as we put together a strategy for the family ongoing. Different in kind conversation. And what's interesting is that conversation followed a very purposeful choreography. So going back to the storytelling session yesterday, what we've mapped out here, and if you pick up one of our books, both of our books actually, The Challenger Sale or The Challenger Customer, which go in much more detail around this choreography, you'll see it expressed in a lot of the case examples that we bring. But let me just outline some elements of this choreography that could be helpful to you. There's really three major parts to it. So first of all, in the choreography of conversation that Ascent Capital Management followed in talking to their potential customers, so number one, they were concerned with teaching that customer something new, bringing a compelling idea for them to pay attention to. But secondly, and also important, is they were giving them both rational and emotional motivations or reasons to take action. So in the first instance there, you're teaching them something new. You're saying this is something you haven't considered around the family dynamics of intergenerational wealth transfer, but here are rational and emotionally compelling arguments for why you should consider these things. And again, it's important to both teach them something new and give them a compelling or motivating reason to take action, to ultimately lead to your differentiated solution, not with it. So if you think about it, what's interesting about this purposeful choreography, going back all the way to Aristotle, it begins with an element of ethos, building your credibility because you have an idea that they haven't yet considered, but also has an element of logos and pathos, both rational and emotional arguments, to ultimately provide, in the language of theater, the deus ex machina. You're revealing a solution at the end that the customer or client or organization can better appreciate. So what's interesting, if you talk to Michael Cole, who at the time was president of Ascent Private Capital Management, he saw a measured difference in their wealth managers and the kinds of conversations that they were having. Using this challenger approach, this new messaging approach, feels much less like selling and more like consulting, which was a first for a lot of us who have sold in a traditional manner for much of our careers. We're able to close a $25 million piece of business just days after adopting this. So it's interesting how it, for them, just changed dramatically the nature of the conversation they were having by feeling less salesy, by focusing less on them and more leading in the conversation with the concerns of the individuals they were selling to. And it's not just in wealth management that this type of thing works. We've seen this work across, regardless of what you're selling, whether that's technology, whether that's food ingredients and manufacturing, whether that's electronics, or SaaS software, energy, industrial manufacturing equipment. We've seen this type of approach, this type of choreography change the nature of sales conversations in all different kinds of industries. Because honestly, at the end of the day, whether you're selling oil and gas equipment, enterprise software, or just an idea that can change the world, you need to persuade people on the other side of the table in a very similar way. Now, I think we had some one-pagers. We didn't get them out at the tables, but it's fine. We can email them to anybody who wants them. But I put together a one-pager that could give you some exercises afterward if you want to really try applying this. We'll make sure that we get that out to anybody who wants it. But let's talk. We talked about the right message. Let's talk about the right skills for delivering that message. I want to tell you a little bit about a study we did of individual salespeople. And we did this study across hundreds of different organizations all over the world. In fact, our original study was about 9,000 individual salespeople. And we've since grown that study to about 27,000 individual salespeople. And in this study, we wanted to understand from their leaders or their managers' perspective how they behaved. And so we had about 40 different characteristics or attributes. We had their managers evaluate them across those 40 attributes. And then we ran a factor analysis to see which of those attributes tended to cluster together into a profile. So it was one of the biggest profiling exercises of salespeople or individuals in a role to persuade that's ever been done in history. And what was fascinating to us is we found that over 90%, about 94% of those individuals fell very squarely into one of 5 distinct profiles. And so let me go through each of these profiles because they're very interesting and you'll see how they're somewhat mutually exclusive of one another. So starting on the left-hand side, the lone wolf. This is that individual who behaves in his or her own way in selling. Their characteristics may be a little bit different than the way you would do it. In fact, we say a lot of organizations would fire these individuals if it weren't for the fact that they perform so well. The second is the problem solver. These are individuals keenly focused on post-sales or post-transactional customer support. Any issue that individual they have a relationship with needs, they're there to solve or provide for that. The relationship builder, the individual who is keenly interested in social relationships as a way to build an interest in the other person to do business with them. The hard worker, very dedicated in following exact steps in a sales or a decision-making process. And then finally, this one we called the challenger, which was new in kind from something we had previously seen, which is an individual who has a different view of that customer's organization. They understand it very deeply, and they want to motivate that customer to take a new kind of action. So 5 very distinct profiles for selling or persuading. And individuals tend to really emphasize one of these at the expense of the others. Think about it like a college major that salespeople all over the world tend to have. But the key question this begs, of course, is which of these individuals tend to perform better than others in a complex selling environment? So we cut the data. And we cut the data specifically by high performers and core performers, but high performers specifically in what we call complex selling environments. You're selling an idea that needs to be integrated into that client's or customer's a business or organization. It takes a while to complete the sale. It's probably very expensive. It's a big decision to make. So which individuals of these 5 profiles tend to overrepresent among high performers? And you can see the data here. In a complex environment, over half of these individuals emphasized that challenger profile. The lone wolf was 25%, the hard worker 10%, the problem solver 7%, and the relationship builder all but disappeared among high performers. If you really want to perform well, if you really want to engage and persuade in today's environment, it's these challenger principles that we would recommend considering adopting. And let me tell you what these principles are. When you looked at the profile, you looked at what these individuals did differently, it really came down to 4 major competencies. Let me start in the bottom left here. They would teach for differentiation. Right? They would bring that unique perspective, that new idea to the person they were trying to persuade. They would tailor that to the various individuals in that consensus group. They would take control. They recognize the importance of increasing ease and reducing complexity in a decision-making process. They would map out that decision-making process and make sure they had ways to be prescriptive and support it as it went through. But importantly, and this is important to consider, they would create and manage what we call constructive tension in those conversations. Bringing a compelling idea to people, particularly with data and emotional stories that motivates action, creates tension. And that's a good thing. The great Daniel Pink, in his book To Sell is Human, articulates this idea of constructive tension better than I've ever heard it articulated. He says we need to agitate, but not irritate. That's the critical balance. How do we agitate that individual to take action? The playwright David Mamet says there is one question that keeps an individual in his or her seat throughout the play, and that is the question, what happens next? Because anticipating or being interested in what happens next creates tension. And if we're in the job of persuading other people to make decisions, or we lead teams who persuade people to make decisions, we have to help ourselves, help them as well, get comfortable managing tension in those conversations. Now, this is an exercise that will be part of that sheet as well, where you can evaluate in your organization how well you manage tension with some basic true or false questions. So we'll get that out to you as well so you can look at that. I want to briefly, before we go to a question and answer, talk about the right decision maker, because this is a third and equally important piece. Now, we wanted to study the profiles of sellers. We looked at what makes messaging compelling. We understood the profile of the salesperson, the behavioral model for a salesperson who can most effectively deliver that message. We also wanted to understand the profile of the individual who receives the message. And is there an individual better positioned to receive a message than another? So what we did is we went out to buyers or individuals making a decision, and we evaluated which of those buyers across a number of different criteria, similar to our study of sellers, fit into a particular profile as an advocate or a supporter of making a decision. And some of the characteristics that we looked at are readily accessible and willing to talk, provides information typically unavailable to a supplier or a seller, is pro the supplier's solution or product or idea, good at influencing, convincing others, always speaks the truth, credible, their colleagues in their organization seek their input, they convey new ideas to other stakeholders in savvy ways, they deliver on their commitments, they will personally gain from this idea or this sale, and they often network the seller or the individual calling on them with other stakeholders. Very great profile, right? We're trying to find these individuals who have all of these characteristics. And in our population of 700 of these individuals, you know how many we found? We found one. The reason for that is because nobody in the world who you are selling to or trying to persuade will have all of these characteristics. Portions of these characteristics will manifest in a whole host of individual profiles that you sell to or try to persuade. So what do those profiles look like? Well, there are 7 of them, and we can break them down into really 3 distinct categories. So we profiled these individuals similar to those 5 profiles for sellers. There are individuals like the go-getter who's super interested in supporting growth or new ideas in the organization, the teacher who is interested in bringing those or explaining those ideas to others in the organization, the skeptic. What's interesting about what Daniel said yesterday in the storytelling session, he talked about skeptics. He said, skeptics are skeptical because they care. It's not always bad to have somebody skeptical of the idea when you bring it. Then you have individuals like the guide who's going to guide you through the organization and tell you everybody you should talk to, or the friend who's going to be super nice when you reach out to them, or the climber who's interested in making a name for his or herself. And of course, the blocker, who we're all familiar with the blocker, right? That individual who's got a different idea than what you're bringing to the table. Now, what's interesting about these different profiles is some of them are much more likely to support a change or drive organizational action, and some of them are much less likely to do so. And you can see how they play out with the various coefficients on this scale. So blockers clearly much less interested in making something happen. Go-getters, teachers, and skeptics, much more interested. So we call the go-getters, the teachers, and the skeptics collectively mobilizers. We call the guides, the friends, and the climbers collectively talkers. And the importance here is identifying, do I have a mobilizer? Am I talking to a mobilizer? Or am I talking to a talker or a blocker? Because if we engage mobilizers, it drives a 31% increase in the likelihood of being a high-performing seller. High performers find mobilizers, they engage mobilizers, they support mobilizers. Core performers get excited when they find a friend because that friend is interested in talking to them, but can't necessarily drive organizational action. Now, in this one-pager that we will get out to those who are interested, we have a little just framework for determining in a persuasive conversation whether you're talking to a mobilizer, a talker, or a blocker, and hopefully that's helpful to you. But I want to just wrap it up here. I know I've thrown a lot at you. I've shown you some research. I've talked through a couple of examples. But let's just go back to the frame here of the right message, using the right skills to the right decision maker. On the right message, we need to lead to, not with the solution, because we need to take them through a purposeful choreography to help them appreciate what we are bringing, what we are offering. And we need to bring commercial insight that, number one, teaches them something new about their situation, their organization, their circumstance, their business, their interests, and motivates them with rational and emotionally compelling arguments to take action. Number two, in the right skills, we need to develop a compelling profile. Add to wherever we may be today this challenger profile of teaching, tailoring, taking control, and managing constructive tension. Then thirdly, we need to identify the right mobilizer who can support us in persuading others and building consensus in the decision-making process. I hope I've taught you a couple of things that maybe you can take away, maybe apply to the work that you're doing. If you're interested in learning more about them, we've published 3 books, The Challenger Sale, The Challenger Customer, The Effortless Experience. I think you'll find the research and the insights in them interesting. We also have ongoing webinars and podcasts you might find interesting that you can learn more about at our website, which is www.challengerinc.com. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn, hear your ideas and thoughts, but it's been a great pleasure speaking to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Spencer. Maybe for some of you this isn't new. When I first read The Challenger Sale, I was just really taken by the insight and just ways to apply it. So I was jotting down a few questions, and if you all in the audience have questions, please raise your hand. We have a mic. We'll get it to you. My first question, is this approach, the Challenger approach, only applicable to our U.S. partners that are in the room? Or is this something that, because Atlas Network is a global network from all over the world, how does the Challenger approach apply to our partners globally?
It's a great question, and it's actually one we've been exploring for a number of years. So when we did the original study, it had a global presence to it, but as we've expanded it in our data set, we have individuals from 58 different countries, I believe, as part of this. And what's interesting is we've cut the data specific to different regions of the world, and what we find is primarily different about it isn't necessarily where people are going or where high performers tend to find a way to differentiate themselves. Now, it's true that, for example, when we cut the data in Asia, it's not as stark a difference. I think it's a 2.5 times rather than a 4.7 times greater likelihood of being a high performer if you're using the Challenger skills. But where people come from, what their kind of default setting is, does differentiate by different regions of the world. And the best layering for that we've found is there's a model back in the 1990s by Richard Lewis called the Lewis model, which looks at different kind of behavioral profiles around the world and breaks them down into 3 kind of points in a triangle. You have linear active, multi-active, and reactive cultures. And what was interesting when we took our data and layered it on top of that, we saw like almost a universal similarity. So for example, linear active cultures are like, the United States, Australia, Western Europe. And we found in those particular cultures that core performing individuals, or like the status quo, was a pretty even balance across the 5 profiles. Now, if you move into a multi-active culture like Latin America, Middle East, or Africa, you then tend to see a heavy presence of that relationship builder profile across all of those. If you move into a reactive, like Asia, for example, you would see in Northeast Asia, like Japan and Korea, you'd see a heavy emphasis of the problem solver profile. And then in emerging Asia, like India, China, Indonesia, the Philippines, you would see the hard worker profile. A lot of that is because of the growth and kind of the, people are tightly managed in those organizations to follow, in those countries to follow a particular process. So what we found is it's not as much kind of where people are going. We see a high-performing differentiation among challengers in all of these different regions, but being appreciative of where people are coming from and what's kind of the comfortable status quo method for engaging or persuading people.
That's great. One other question, since I am in development and fundraising, I can easily see, and as you presented, how this would be applicable to what I call a prospect, a new donor, someone that I am meeting for the first time, can take these steps and put them into action. What about someone that has already been a donor, someone that's already in our system? We interact with them, constantly. They've been a donor for 5 years. Are there ways that we can use Challenger for those individuals as well?
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, so when we did the original buying study that I showed, that 53%, right, of the sales experience, what we were looking at there was we're looking at what builds loyalty. And I define loyalty in 3 ways. Number 1, it's a desire to do more business with you more often. Number 2, it's a willingness to advocate on your behalf. And number 3, it's a willingness to experiment with you around new opportunities or ideas. And so that's how kind of loyalty plays out in those different boxes, like I said. But we were always curious about it as well. And we said, we want to study very specifically. And so on the sales side, on the commercial side, we looked at what are called account managers. We said, let's look specifically at account managers and what makes a difference in high-performing account management behavior. So working exclusively with existing relationships. And what was interesting is the first thing we did is we went out to a bunch of these individuals in this role, and we said, tell us whether you agree or disagree with this statement. We said, providing an overabundance of service and support is a clear way to grow an opportunity or to grow a relationship. And 88% of them said, yes, we agree with that. That's exactly the path we would take to grow a relationship with an existing client or an existing organization we serve. And then we ran the data and we looked at what actually makes a difference. And it is true that doing that, an overabundance of service and support creates a 101% increase in the likelihood of retaining that business. So think about like you have a $25,000 yearly relationship with somebody. If you really serve them and support them around that, you have a much greater likelihood of retaining that business. But there was zero statistically significant correlation between doing that behavior and growing that opportunity. So 88% of these people were wrong based on the stats. What we found actually does make a difference is something that we've later termed customer improvement, which is the idea of I have implemented something in your organization, in your business, what have you, that has led to fundamental changes in the way you perform, in the results that you get. And I'm able to demonstrate to you what those look like. And when that was present, that idea of customer improvement was present, there was a 34% increase in the likelihood of growing that account. It was the most powerful element we could find. And not only that, it increased the likelihood of retaining, and it increased the likelihood of protecting against some other competitor, some other offer coming in and displacing you. So it really was the key to retention growth. And that idea of customer improvement is tightly aligned with what we've been talking about, these skills and behaviors of this challenger profile.
That's great. Any questions? I have more, so I can keep going. Up in the back.
Hi, thank you. It was really very, very compelling. So my name is Kenny Wagner. I'm with Students for Liberty. And as with Chad, I'm in the development business. And so the people that we interact with aren't running an organization. So what they're looking to get out of their philanthropic dollars is a little bit different. So I can talk to them about how their contribution helps my organization accomplish more, but I don't see how I'm in a position to explain to them how their contribution and their interaction with me helps them function in a different way. So could you bridge that gap for me?
Yeah, and it's an interesting gap, and it's kind of one I've been thinking about a little bit. I guess it depends on your definition and not knowing, well, your situation other than what you just explained to me. There has to be some benefit in what it is that you would ultimately provide to them, right? There would have to be some kind of change in their status quo way of thinking or behaving that would benefit them by partnering with you. And I think focusing on that, whether that's a kind of a material real benefit or just kind of an intrinsic motivation for an individual would be, I think, something you would want to focus on. But the most important thing here, I think, is people are motivated when the experience is about them, is focused on them, or they can see how they relate to or are part of that experience. So often we think that building a person's interest in us is a result of us, right, and what we present about ourselves. But I think it goes back to Dale Carnegie's old statement, which is you can make more friends in 2 months, being interested in others, legitimately interested in others, than you can in 2 years by trying to make them interested in you. Now, you can ultimately lead to an interest in you by showing, what that will achieve, but leading to you and not with you is the critical difference. At least that's been our experience in the various spaces where we've worked.
Did I see another hand? Yes.
Thank you. This is wonderful. I'm Cindy Kilduff with State Policy Network. I'm curious about whether that choreography is the same or if you would recommend it be different. If you're presenting material in an op-ed or a written proposal to a prospect where you don't necessarily have the benefit of direct interaction with your audience.
It's a wonderful question, and it's actually one we continue to explore. So, and if you read our second book, there's actually a section in the book that talks about how to apply the same principles of this choreography to marketing content. And there's really 3 ways to think about that, or 3 critical elements of translating this choreography or this approach to marketing. And there are 3 different things that marketing content tends to do. Short content will spark attention, so spark. Longer form content will introduce a concept, and then there needs to be some element in that confronts that individual's status quo thinking, challenges that individual's status quo thinking to do something different, and can be both rational or emotional. So spark, introduce, confront. What we have found, there are certain kind of elements of, say, a digital marketing ecosystem like a website that you don't want to take people through a journey. People go to a website for a particular reason. They want to understand who you are and what you do in kind of not in a linear way, but in a just presented way. But when you are creating content like white papers or like videos or things like that, we've seen a lot of success with organizations of following that choreography. Or even say something like a pitch deck, the way you order the pitch deck. Most pitch decks that people share with me for feedback, the first couple of slides of those pitch decks are like map of the world, all the places where we've done work, all the cool logos that we've done work with, how long we've been around. It's all about you. It's not about the idea or the concept that you're bringing. And so we suggest people flip that concept on its head.
That's great advice. There.
Hi, Les Rubin, Main Street Economics. If you're trying to sell an idea, how does this apply? For example, I would like to convince some people that they need to learn more about economics. How would you go about selling that?
Are you talking, just for clarification, broadly speaking?
Broadly speaking, one of our objectives is to reach the voting public so that they will understand they need to know more about economics to vote intelligently.
So here's the first question I would ask is, what are they missing today by not knowing enough about economics? What is it that they're missing today that you can teach them? So this is the thing you're not considering about being educated in economics that you should consider. So that's your reframe, that's your new idea or piece of information that you're bringing to them. And then the second piece is, what is it costing you in not understanding economics? What opportunities are you missing? What about your current situation could be uncomfortable or untenable because you don't have this understanding? And see, those are your first two elements of the choreography, right? What you're missing is costing you, and lead to, and here's a different way of thinking about economics education, or here's the new way you should consider walking, which is being more educated in economics, and here's how we can help you do it. So that's the way I would construct the choreography just now off the top of my head, but would love to talk about it more. Yes?
Yeah.
No?
Hey, I'm Christina Dent with End It for Good. I'm curious, Chad, how you can, speaking just of your work in development, kind of how you've implemented some of these ideas into the work that you do with Atlas on development specific to fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, it's really how you shape your approach with who you're going after. And like he said in his presentation, fully understanding who you're meeting with is so important. I'm going to talk to this person differently than this person because they're different people, they have different backgrounds. And so coming at it from that point, but then also, again, to the point of what's in it for them, that you do need to figure that out. And maybe it is just the idea of a good feeling. Like, if I support this group, I will feel good about myself. That is something in it for them. They feel good about charity, and they feel good about the work that the groups that they're supporting. And so for me, it's an approach. You get the meeting, you sit down, and I try as much as possible to just ask questions at the beginning to learn as much more information about them as I can right off the bat. Because then for me personally, that helps navigate where I will take the conversation. I can do all the research, which we do. If we're good at our jobs, we have a team that helps us to know going in, this is what they do, this is who they are. But so much can be learned just in those first few minutes of asking a few questions about them, about their business, especially if it's a business person. They love to talk about what they've created. Most are very proud that they've created something, and they're eager to tell you about it. And so I think just understanding them as much as possible, because then you'll know how to navigate the conversation, for me has been the most important. I have a question for you, Spencer. Oh, yeah, Lyle.
Maybe just to specifically answer your question, in a proposal that we had a couple years back, we had a donor, wealthy business individual, and we were kind of dancing around it. Emails were going back and forth, and nothing was happening with this donor, and the donor had an idea of how they wanted to see change. And we didn't accept the premise. So it kind of made me think about this. And so the first page of the proposal was pretty much exactly what Spencer said, We reframed the issue of what was going on in that region. And then, what we saw is the loss and the problems, which he had a sense of, but kind of really crystallizing what that was, and then what's the emotional and rational reason why the model that we have in place addresses that in a unique way. So we didn't accept how he felt like the solution would be to answer and address that problem in the region. We felt like the way that we could present was better. And we put that in front of him and that proposal. The first 3 pages, again, were very much the first 2 of the dance, and then the last 3 was, well, here's who's on the team, and here's why you can believe what we said works. And we ended up getting a $3 million check from him to do some work. But before that, we were dancing around. I think we were trying to do all the relationship building and some of the other stuff of some of the other profiles, and it wasn't until we said, we don't think what you said is going to work. We think this will work better. And he jumped on it.
And being bold to make the ask. I think part of the time before was this dance, and it's, okay, we're now best friends. Where do we go from here? The purpose was he was a wealthy individual that wanted to see change in a region. We are advocates of change and can make that change happen. And this is what we present, why we think what we're going to do is best, and be confident in it too. I mean, we're like, this is what we're going to do. Here's how it's going to change. Here's how we're going to track it. And at the end, as Lau said, he went with it. We have a couple minutes left. If people leave here today and love this, outside of going to the website, reading the book, do you have just a few practical steps? They get back to the office on Monday. I know it's coming to the year end, but there's no time to start than right now. What are things that we could do to start this and get it going?
Yeah, so two places to start that I would suggest is, number one, take a real close look at your initial outreach to individuals. When you talk about, right, like a prospect, somebody I'm trying to engage, look at the email, look at the way you would conduct a phone conversation with that individual and say, am I leading with me, or do I have something compelling, a new insight or an idea that perhaps they're not appreciating that I'm going to share with them? That's the best place organizations start, is they look at that first initial outreach and try to tune that outreach to spark or catch the attention of the individual, being focused on them. Secondly, is to really look at how you tend to craft an initial conversation with somebody, whether that be a new prospect, whether that be somebody you've had a relationship with for a while, and look at the emphasis of time and effort around the components of that dialogue. What you'll find is people tend to typically do just enough preparation for that conversation to feel sufficient to have it. And then, of course, what they focus on is building rapport, and then asking some open-ended questions to understand the individual, and then talking about you is kind of the biggest portion of that. We would recommend really changing the dynamic of that initial conversation. Do a little bit more preparation or homework to make sure you've really got a compelling new idea and a rational and an emotional reason to embrace it or to follow it. And then spend the bulk of that time, number one, exploring that individual's status quo thinking, right, through measured investigation of like, hey, this is the issue I think you should appreciate that perhaps you're not appreciating today, and exploring that with the individual such that you can change or reframe their thinking around that idea. Now, people are nervous to shift sort of commercial conversations in that direction because they're like, well, they won't appreciate me if I don't spend a lot of time talking about me. But again, it's not about you. It's about the idea you need them to embrace. And so just think about the time and the effort that you spend in those and try to tune differently your initial dialogue.
That's awesome. And we are out of time, but I spoke to Spencer earlier. He is going to be here through tonight. I believe the sheets were handed out. So later, if you come up with an idea or a question, try and track him down at the reception or at the dinner this evening. He would be happy to speak more with you. But to that, once again, Spencer, thank you so much.
Wonderful pleasure. Thank you.